One of the most liberating ideas I encountered as a language teacher was that you don't actually need to follow one single method. Instead, teaching can be about making informed decisions based on your learners, your context, and the goals that you have with your learners. This idea is actually known as post-method pedagogy, and it fundamentally changed how many educators think about language teaching. In this episode, I'll tell you everything that you need to know about this method. So, to understand a little bit about why this idea emerged, it helps to have a look briefly into the history of English language teaching. So, throughout the 20th century, language teaching was dominated by what we might call the methods era. So this was this very long succession of approaches claimed to offer improved solutions to the challenges of language instructions. And this included things like the grammar translation method, the direct method, audiolingualism, and of course later communicative language teaching. And you can find out about all of these methods on our channel. Each of these methods, or approaches as we could call them, proposed a coherent set of teaching procedures and often implied that if you followed these correctly, it could produce better language outcomes. However, by the late 20th century, many scholars began to question this entire enterprise. So rather than proposing yet another method, they began to ask whether the concept of method itself might be limiting us in terms of how we think about teaching. It was in this context that the idea of post-method pedagogy emerged. In this lecture, we'll explore what prompted this move towards post-method thinking, what post-method means, and how it continues to influence language teaching today. So post-method actually emerged from growing dissatisfaction with several assumptions that had shaped the methods era. So that era was built on the idea that a method represented a theoretically coherent set of teaching procedures, defining best practices, that some methods would produce better learning outcomes rather than others, and that teacher educators or teacher education should focus on training teachers to implement these methods. By 1994, a scholar by the name of Kumaravadivelu'sconcept introduced the term post-method, arguing that teachers needed to develop context-sensitive pedagogies rather than rely on these kind of like universal teaching methods. Importantly, this was not a call for like some random mixing of techniques. Instead, it really emphasized like a principled decision making grounded in the realities of a particular classroom. So several developments contributed to this shift, and let's go through them one by one. So the first was that scholars increasingly recognized that many dominant methods were culturally bound. Most had been developed in Western education context and reflected a lot of assumptions aligned with those systems. So Kumaravadivelu'sconcept described these as center-based methods, criticizing them as approaches built around idealized concepts for idealized teaching contexts. The second was classroom research, and this showed that teachers rarely implemented methods exactly as described. And think about this yourself when you're teaching. If you're trying to implement a method, normally you have to change something in some ways. That makes complete sense. So even when teachers claim to use the same method, their classroom practices often differed considerably. So teaching was shaped by teachers, their experience, their beliefs, and their professional judgment, rather than sticking to a method rigidly. Third, researchers increasingly acknowledged that successful language learning depends on many factors beyond methods. So as Williams and Burden observe, elements such as engaging content, learner motivation, and teacher-learner relationships, and things like shared belief in the value of classroom activities may be more important than a method itself. Finally, scholars observed that methodological theory often progressed through cycles of reaction. So new methods frequently emerge by rejecting the previous weaknesses of the earlier ones. So in practice, teachers often adopted a more balanced approach and adapted ideas from different traditions rather than following methodological fashions like really strictly. So these critiques of the methods era led scholars to really rethink how pedagogy itself should be conceptualized. Let's talk then a little bit about the core principles and design of the post-method. So post-method does not reject theory or existing approaches of teaching. Instead, it reconceptualizes the relationship between theory and classroom practice. Kumaravadivelu'sconcept proposed three key pedagogical parameters that characterize post-method pedagogy: particularity, practicality, and possibility. Let's start by thinking about particularity. So particularity refers to the need for pedagogy that is sensitive to a specific group of teachers teaching a specific group of learners, pursuing particular goals within a particular institution and sociocultural context. So this contrasts with the method concept, which assumes that teaching procedures can be applied universally, which of course they can. Practicality concerns the relationship between theory and practice. So post-method challenges the idea that theory is produced by researchers and then applied by teachers. Instead, teachers are recognized as theorists of their own practice who develop local understandings through reflection on their practice and investigation of their teaching. Finally, possibility. So possibility draws on insights from critical pedagogy. It recognizes that teaching is never actually a neutral act, and classroom practices are shaped by broader social and political forces. And this includes questions about whose language norms are valued, whose knowledge counts, and how education can reproduce or challenge social inequalities. Kumaravadivelu'sconcept also proposed a set of macro strategies that serve as broad pedagogical guidelines. So these include ideas such as maximizing learning opportunities, promoting learner autonomy, facilitating negotiated interactions, integrating language skills, and raising cultural awareness. These macro strategies are not classroom procedures to be followed step by step. Rather, they function as generative principles from which teachers develop contextually appropriate techniques. So context is super important to post-method pedagogy. Within this framework, post-method pedagogy is often associated with two related ideas. So the first is principled eclecticism, and the second is principled pragmatism. Let's look at principled eclecticism first of all. So principled eclecticism involves selecting practices from different methods based on theoretical understanding. Principled pragmatism goes further by emphasizing that teachers develop their own theories through engagement with classroom practice. Let's think then about classroom implementation. So in practical terms, post-method does not prescribe specific classroom techniques. Instead, it provides a framework for informed pedagogical decision-making. Teachers working within a post-method perspective begin with context analysis. So this involves understanding learners' goals, their background, and learning conditions, as well as institutional constraints, available resources, and socio-cultural expectation. Pedagogic decisions are then grounded in this understanding rather than in allegiance to a particular method. So teachers draw on their knowledge of existing approaches as resources rather than rule books. So for example, a teacher might combine meaning-focused interaction associated with communicative language teaching with form-focused instruction when appropriate. So they might incorporate collaborative learning practices or activities designed to raise language awareness. What's really important to understand about post-method pedagogy is that what matters isn't actually the origin of the technique, but its suitability for the context that is in front of you and the context that you're teaching. This approach actually requires teachers to act as reflective practitioners who continually evaluate what works, why it works, and how teaching practices might be improved. Activities such as action research, reflective writing, and professional collaboration become important tools for teacher development. And it's actually like a really empowering technique for any language teacher. Let's look at it then from a curriculum perspective. So post-method thinking also encourages a broader view of language education that extends far beyond classroom techniques. Effective teaching through the lens of post-method pedagogy depends on how different elements of the curriculum kind of come together. So these include needs analysis, learning goals, syllabi, assessment practices, and program evaluation. From this perspective, needs analysis should consider learners' actual purposes for using English. Syllabi should reflect authentic language use rather than purely abstract linguistic sequencing. Assessment should evaluate meaningful communicative ability rather than a narrow conformity to particular language norms. Let's think then a little bit about critical perspectives and contemporary relevance. Despite its influence, post-method pedagogy has also faced really important critiques. So one concern is that the framework may place quite unrealistic demands on teachers. Post-methods assumes teachers have the theoretical knowledge, the reflective capacity, and also the professional autonomy needed to develop context-sensitive pedagogies. In many educational systems, if we're going to be realistic about it, teachers work under really quite rigid curricula, high-stakes examinations, and limited opportunities for professional development. Another concern is that abandoning methods entirely may disadvantage novice teachers. So beginners often benefit from structured guidance as they develop professional expertise. Therefore, without that kind of support, post-method risks becoming aspirational rather than really practical. There are also ongoing questions about teacher education. So even if methods are not taught as prescriptive models, teacher education programs must still provide disciplinary knowledge that helps teacher make informed decisions in complex classrooms. In practice, methods have not disappeared. Frameworks such as communicative language teaching and task-based approaches continue to shape curricula and also materials. Many scholars therefore see post-method not as the end of methods, but a way to critically engage with them. Post-method thinking also connects with other contemporary developments in language education. So Global English's language teaching, for example, shares post-method's emphasis on understanding learners' actual needs in the multilingual world rather than focusing exclusively on native speaker norms. Similarly, culturally responsive and decolonising approaches to education highlight the importance of local knowledge, identity, and also the power that these things have in shaping pedagogy. Let's just wrap up then and think that post-method pedagogy presents a shift in how the language teaching field understands the relationship between theory and practice. Rather than searching for the perfect method, the focus turns toward developing teachers who can make informed, context-sensitive decisions in the real classroom. And this doesn't mean that theory and research becomes irrelevant. Instead, they provide resources that teachers interpret and adapt in relation to their own teaching context. So in this sense, post-method is less a single framework and more an ongoing conversation about how teaching can remain responsive, reflective, and socially aware. If you want to know more about TESOL methods, please check out our channel and don't forget to like and subscribe. We will see you in the next episode.